Hello, good morning or good evening. I'm Masood Raja and welcome to this this whole welcome to the webinar. And I apologized, I had not kept in mind that it's going to be Eid. So because of that, I don't think a lot of people will be joining us, but if you are, Eid Mubarak to all of you. And I hope you had a wonderful day and spent time with your family despite the problems of Corona and everything else. So today's topic is generally a conversation about literary theory. What is it? What does it do? Why do we need it? Or anything that comes to your mind. So for me, I don't go into like a very complicated definitions of theory. Literary theory for me is any philosophical knowledge, any knowledge about texts and textuality, reading, interpreting. All of these theories come together to inform an act of reading and writing about literature or teaching it. Even people who say they espouse no theory are always within a theory. Okay. And the way I encourage my students to learn is to first learn the basic mechanics of it, who has said what and why, what are the basic different schools of literary theory. And then I encourage them to understand the ones that appeal to them so that they can then adopt their stance on reading and publishing and writing based on their understanding of that theoretical approach. I personally am very eclectic. When people ask me, are you a Marxist? I was like, yes, sometimes. Sometimes I'm a structuralist. Sometimes I'm a post-structuralist. So for me, theory is a tool, and it allows me to open texts up, write about them, talk about them, understand them from different perspectives. So I've never been able to align myself to like just one theory. So if you have any questions, first of all, let me know that you all are here. But if you have any questions, we can start a conversation about it. If not, I will just point to some resources that are available already on the channel. And those are, I have a whole set of lectures and conversations on Terry Eagleton's book, Literary Theory and Introduction. So you can actually watch them and then post questions under each individual value video. Because the reason I use Eagleton is because even though he's slightly dated, the book came out in mid-70s, but the reason I like Eagleton's text is because he gives you not just here is what a theory is. He gives you who has explained certain things under a theory. And then he also gives you the counter arguments, like what other people might have said here about that particular theory. So you get the whole debate, right? You don't just get here is new criticism, here are 10 things to learn about it. And I find that extremely useful. Now, you don't have to agree with Eagleton. Of course, he himself is positioned as a Marxist scholar. And that's not the point. The point is to see how he discusses it. And then what can you take away from it? And then you go into reading individual theorists and how did they come up with whatever they say about texts, about readers, and about the authors. Yeah, Tommy, yes, I actually have worked with DeLeo. He on quite a few projects. I contributed 3 entries to his um, huge book on theory. We know each other through Robin Goodman, who's my mentor, and from all the radical caucus. I know what anti-theory is. I don't think so. It poses a threat. Anti-theory to me is kind of, a reactionary response to theory. There are several reasons for which people oppose theory. One of them is, of course, they are intimidated by it. So they're like, "What? We don't do theory, we do textual scholarship." What is textual scholarship? That is, it employs methods of reading. If you are even looking at symbols, you are in a theory. If you're looking at, uh, any other thing, you're still using theory. Now, what it does is the danger of being openly anti-theory in an English department, it does a disservice to students. Because if you convince them that theory is bad, you don't need it, you need to be a scholar, and that means you read a text closely. First of all, sometimes reading a text closely doesn't even render the meanings. You will have to become a historicist, you'll have to become a Marxist, because otherwise you're just looking at the text. Two, the worst thing than that is that when students hit the job market and go and give their talk or even answer questions about, simple things, teaching or about writing about a text, if their ideas are not theoretically sophisticated, they won't be able to make any headway in the job market from a practical point of view. And I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago, I was on a search committee for a Victorianist position. And we had this candidate from Harvard, smart, intelligent scholar. But she was using a concept in her dissertation, which was called the indignant reader. And so she had crafted that concept. This is what I mean by the indignant reader. And then here is what I can see in, I think it was on Hardy's work, right? So my job on the committee was to ask the theory question. So my question to her was, okay, obviously, the moment you invoke the term the indignant reader, you are using reception theory, right? How a reader receives a text. Now, could you point out to me, where do you get this idea? Are you using George Poulet? Are you using, Stanley Fish or anyone else who are major reception theorists? And sadly, she had no answer to that. She thought that she could sit in her library and coin a term without realizing that that term exists within a larger structure of thought, which is called the reception theory, right? That's where the difference comes in practical terms when you are interviewing for a job. Another thing that theory allows you to do is it gives you the ability to extrapolate. And what do I mean by that? If you know your Marxism, if you know your Foucault, if you know your Derrida, right, if you've read them, and someone asks you a question about Foucault, and you might have not read that particular work, but since you know how Foucault thought of power, right, you can extrapolate that this is what Foucault would have said about it. Or then you can read a text and extrapolate from little information. You can also find out, as soon as you read the first few paragraphs of a critical paper, where is the author coming from? Theory allows you to do that. Is it a Marxist approach? If it is a Marxist paper, what kind of Marxism is at play, right? Is it Lenin, right? Is it, coming from the Trotsky tradition? Is it the workerist Marxism, right? composition is, which lineage is it coming from? Is it structuralist Marxism? Theory allows you to do that. It allows you to read texts, with much more nuance. Okay, let's go to Imran. Thank you for joining us on Eid. Can you recommend a few reference books? Absolutely. So, as I already mentioned, I know Terry Eagleton's book is slightly dated, right? So if you just want to know what schools of thought are there, just do an internet search and you will find them. And they will give you what each means. Here is new criticism. Here is, use that. Don't need to buy a book for that. But if you want a nuanced discussion of, okay, here is how new criticism emerges, here are its major theorists, right? This is what they said. This was what was said in response to it, right? So if you want a book that gives you the whole debate of each school of thought, Eagleton's book on literary theory and introduction is absolutely still the best book, introductory book on literary theory. Now, what to pair it with? So get any edition of the Norton Critical Edition, Norton edition on literary theory and criticism. Because what it does is it compiles for you major theorists from different schools of thought and their, what I would say, their significant essays on theory. So then what you do is you read general discussion of theory in Eagleton, and then you go and read those theories. First, the excerpts provided in the Norton, and then from there you go beyond and read, widely the longer works of those theorists. So overall, then you have an introduction with discussions of the text itself and the theories themselves, and then you read in depth. Now, that's what I do in my literary theory class, is that we read Eagleton, and then we go and read the texts by different philosophers and scholars. So that's the approach that has worked for me and often works for my students as well. So I will highly recommend it. And so that means I think I answered your question too. How should a beginner go about with literary theory? So remember, keep in mind that theory is intimidating. There is no doubt about that. And my wife had a horrible experience. Her PhD is in Renaissance studies. So as a graduate student, she asked her professor, I'm lost in this class. What should I do? And the professor told her, I don't know. You just jump in. I think that's a bad answer. The correct answer is break it down, right? So you first need to understand, okay, what are different theories? So as I said, do a web search. Purdue has a beautiful website which explains different theoretical schools. Print it out, read it. That gives you a basic understanding of, oh, this is what new criticism is. This is what reader response is. This is what feminism is. So you have a general idea. Then pick up any book. I recommend Eagleton and read it carefully, highlight it, mark it on. If you pick up Eagleton, the best thing that I can offer you is that right now on my channel, every single chapter of Eagleton, I have a lecture recorded on it, right? They may not be very comprehensive, but that will give you an additional resource, right? And then, as I said, expand your horizons, right? I mean, read your Foucault, whosoever you want to use, Judith Butler, whosoever appeals to you, Marx, right? And that is the progression, I will say, would work for you. And then another way to practice it is when you are thinking of writing a seminar paper, let's say for your classes. Don't write a safe paper, right? That's a mistake. And there are two reasons for it. One, if you write a safe paper, there is nothing you can do with it afterwards, right? Write a paper that needs to be written, right? So that when you graduate, or even if you have not graduated, you can revise it and submit it, right? It has that possibility. Two, write a theory-informed paper, okay? And that means you will look at a text and you say, okay, I just finished reading Ifuru, It's a feminist text, right? What has been said about it? Now, which feminist can I use? Which theory can I use to further open that text? Now, that trains you in using theory. It's not going to be perfect, right? And, but it is your practice of using theory. Now, you'll have to take into account one thing: know your professor, right? If you have an anti-theory professor, chances are if you use theory, he or she is going to shoot you down. So work with that. My suggestion to my graduate students when they come to me and say, I'm taking a course with so and so, I wrote this paper, here are the suggestions that professor has given me, what should I do? So, 15 years ago, I would have told them to take a stance. And no, I'm more pragmatic now. So I tell them, look, you're not going to convince this person that theory is good. They've spent their entire lifetime not believing in that. So just do what this person is telling you to do. Get out of that class, never look back. So know who you're studying with, right? Okay, so I answered the beginner question. Okay, Anum, let me put your question up. What would you say to people who say that literary theory is something different from cultural or social theory, and I cannot use social theory like Marxism to interpret literary? Yeah, I would say if they are your professors, just say, yes, you are right, and get out of their class. Otherwise, you already know this is a bullshit position to have, right? Because Marxism has always been an accepted theory in literary studies. There are books on it. There are ways of reading. If you read Eagleton's Marxism and Literature, he even defines vocabularies and everything else. So a person like that, depending on what your position is against them, if it's your fellow graduate student, have a debate with them. If it's a professor and you are in their class, obviously you can't do that. So just say yes, pragmatically speaking, because you're not going to convince them. But I absolutely believe that any social theory, any theory of economics, I use it. The texts, right? They exist in the world. They are not detached from the world. That idea that somehow a writer can withdraw to a mountain and write even if they do that, they still exist in the world. The world impacts our thought. Our body receives the world, right? We are always in a position, in an ideological position. Even when we are trying to be objective, we will take a different ideological position. I'm not saying that literary works are totally reflectionist, but there is always ideology in them, right? So suggesting that we can't use social theory, we can't use social justice theory, or even theories of pedagogy, I think it's a disservice to us as scholars and to our students. And I have run into that in my publications. One time I sent an article to a European journal, and it was about pedagogy, right? How teaching a text can do certain things. And they basically came back to me and said, this is not a literary analysis paper, because their expectations of it was a literary analysis paper basically talks about the symbols and the tensions and should have nothing to do with teaching, because that's teaching scholarship. And, I turned around and sent it to someone else. But keep in mind what your positionality is, right? What's the power dynamic? So, I'm not giving you idealistic suggestions here. Obviously, you are on a time. You're already stressed. You don't need a fight with a professor on the issue of whether or not you can use theory. But give them what they want, then go and revise it, put the theory back in, send it to a journal, and let them publish it. Okay, so here, Mudassir, what is the role of literary theory in future? Can a text be read without using the lens of a particular theory? Why do we need a theory to interpret a text when we already know what's in the text? That is a beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. Well, the point is that why do we need how do we know that we know what's in the text? right? Through language, right? Now that already places you in a particular position. Because there is nothing that we can understand outside of language, right? So the moment you enter language, if you come through Lacan or even Althusser, you are in ideology. There is no unmediated reading of a text, right? Now, the best you can do is, as you are reading, you question your own prejudices, right? But even then, you align your reading to what you consider non-prejudicial, right? That is also an ideological position. We never always know what is in a text. We can know all the language, the entire vocabulary, and still miss the point. And that is because language works within the context of the text itself, right? We have to look up words, then we have to come back and say, what I've looked up, does it matter within the context? How many times have you used an online thesaurus and it has given you a suggestion which makes perfect sense on the web page, but you know you can't put it in your paper because it would absolutely mean a different thing? So first of all, there is no unmediated access to the text. It is through language. That already makes sure that our ability to understand linguistically will matter, our politics will matter, and the politics of the text will matter. Then, why do we need theory? Now, when you read a text, what you're reading is, first of all, understanding it, and two, you want to know how the text is put together. How do different parts work? If you are doing that, you are a formalist. Now, if you're looking at the tone and what tensions develop in a text, because of that, you are a new critic. If you have convinced yourself that all I need to look at is the text and words on the page, you still are a new critic, right? So you have to use a technique to open the text. That technique is theoretically based, right? Even if you are performing a simple reading, you are still a receiver of the text. So you are in reception theory. Your reception of the text will be mediated through your place in the world. Are you a guy? Are you a woman? Right? Are you, transgender? Your positionality, your material existence in the world will bear upon it. Now, are you a professor? Are you a student? That will have a bearing on your act of reading. All of these things, why do we need theory? Because it allows us to think these things through, right? And I always tell my students, look, there is no way just reading a book will render itself to you, because there is so much behind the words. I don't know if you have read the Satanic Verses. I think it's still banned in Pakistan. But when I teach it in my banned books course, the first two paragraphs, right, where he says, two people are falling from the sky and one of them says, Hoji, Hoji. Look it up. What does Hoji mean? First of all, no meaning would come. So the cultural reference behind that is so thick, right? Where does it come from? If you know Hindi or Urdu, if you've watched the 60s Bollywood movies, most of the songs will have this refrain at the end. Hoji, Hoji, hawa mein udta jaye mera lal dupatta malmal ka. Hoji, Hoji. How will you get there? Simply by reading those sentences. You have to do your research, right? Then you're doing cultural research. You're trying to find out the cultural meanings of the text. So these are but these are all really good questions, right? Okay, Owas. Let's see. Some scholars prefer text to theory, while others consider theory as something superior to text. How this gap can be bridged? Or both have equal weightage or power? Politics. I don't believe in that kind of binaristic structure. I have run into people who believe that. So some people would say that primary texts are primary because, we read them, so theory comes secondary. But the same people who are arguing that are also big fans of Matthew Arnold, right? So if you read Arnold's essay on criticism, I have a lecture on it too. So what he says is, and his argument sums up to this point, that critical thought is more important than creative imagination. And his reason is simply this. And he says if you look at different epochs of literary production, when critical thought was vigorous and strong, people produced better literature. And the reason is simple, because anything that wasn't good enough will not gain any traction in that culture. And accordingly, when the critical thought in any given culture is weak, people can produce mediocre work and it can gain attention because they are producing in an environment where evaluation of creative works is not that vigorous. That is why his point was that the role of the critic is to continue producing more and more critical work so that the environment stays elevated enough for the artists to produce better work. So that's how he gives primacy to critical thought, right? Now, there is some truth to that. I mean, there are certain things in Arnold that I disagree with. What is the truth? Think of it when, I don't know about Pakistan or India, but in United States, if you are applying, or even in Pakistan, why do you want to get into the best program in your region? Like, okay, I want to do a PhD. I want to go to Berkeley, right? Or I want to go to an Ivy League school over here. And in Pakistan, I have to go to Punjab University or Quaid-e-Azam University. First of all, is their prestige, right? Which will open more doors for you. That's obviously the point. But more importantly, the point is that if you get into a good program, the program will then have a really good learning culture. You'll have better professors. You will have an environment where you will learn more, right? And so what are you doing then? You are privileging the critical culture, its quality, because it will be good for your creativity. Even if you're applying to a creative writing program, you will look at your peers, are they going to challenge me in the workshop? So there is some truth to that, this idea that critical thought maybe is more significant than the literature. But I don't actually buy into the binary itself. I think they feed each other. But that's just my opinion. Okay. Okay, is it possible for you to give or suggest a list of important topics we should cover while reading literary theories, considering there are a plethora of works in North? My opinion simply is read the whole thing. Okay, that's just one book. Read the whole thing painstakingly. If you can't read it alone, make a discussion group. In your department, ask 2, 3, 4, 5 of your colleagues, hey guys, can we just meet once a week? Or now, if under Corona, hey, can we do an online session once a week where we start reading from the beginning to the end? The thing is, because learning theory is a lifetime project, there is no moment where you sit down and tell yourself, I've learned it all. No. But what you do need is immersion into the progression of theory, right? And then there will always be regression. You will read someone and they will cite someone. You'll have to go and read them. So I would say, don't just choose, because then there will be gaps in your understanding of the debates of theory. Just read the whole book. It's one book. If you are going to get a PhD, if you're planning on, my graduate students, Anum is one of them, they have more than 230 texts on their exams list, which they have to read and take their comprehensive exams in. And in my opinion, that still doesn't prepare them to be a formidable scholar. It just gives them the beginning point. So, yes, read the whole book. Okay, Anum, I have not read Arnold, but won't there always be subjectivity in criticism, and won't that lead to elitism And won't other social factors have an impact? Absolutely. Now, what the point I missed about where I disagree with Arnold is when he talks about what he calls the literature of detachment. So it is already a deeply elitist position, right? What he's saying is that the critic should not get involved in the everyday exigencies of life. They should not opine about politics, about what's happening. They should just constantly focus on texts and keep writing about them. That's what he calls the scholarship of detachment. So that over a long period, they leave a body of work that can change things. That's his idea. Because what he says is if you get involved in the contingency of things, then you get polemical and you can't have that kind of impact. I used to slightly, obviously disagree with it. I still disagree with it because I want to do political scholarship. But if you produce a body of work over time, not detached from the world, then of course it will have an impact. But those of us who do theory, those of us who teach at universities, we are already part of an elite group, right? You know, we are professors, we are scholars, we have the time and resources to read literary texts and talk about it and think it's an important pursuit. Not many people in the world can afford to do that. The question is, what do we do with that privilege, right? And that's where political scholarship comes in. There is a beautiful book by Bruce Robbins called Feeling Global. And that's exactly what he says, is that we as scholars should learn to question our privilege and question our privileged location, because when we do that, then we get involved with something outside of the academy, in solidarity with others, speaking for others. But trust me, it baffles people when you do that. I have friends and colleagues who get offended because I criticize my own profession because they feel like I'm being disloyal to the profession, right? Because they have internalized this idea that our position is significant and important and we have earned it. Whereas I was trained to question my own positionality, my own privilege, unlearn it so that I can do more political work. It's all a question of where are you coming from. But you're right. Yes, absolutely. That is an elitist position. All right, I have a question from the left field here. Postmodernism can be the extension of modern tenets or totally break up. I have a full video on it. I have a whole webinar on it on the channel, and also a brief introduction to postmodernism. None of the scholars of postmodernism will tell you that postmodernism has its own episteme. No, or that it comes after modernism. The post in postmodernism is simply as silly as the post in postcolonialism. But it does have certain aspects that are playful and that play with major tropes of modernism. But there is none of the major scholars of postmodernism will tell you that there is a clean break between modernism and postmodernism. And then the critics of postmodernism, all the Marxists or people like Habermas, will tell you there is no postmodernism. Modernity itself is an unfinished project. But I do seriously recommend that you should watch one of the old webinars I have on the channel on postmodernism and my brief video on introduction to postmodernism, and these questions will be answered there. Is traditional historicism dead, Tommy? In particular, that cause and effect kind of historicism. Has Foucault and discourse theory made this kind of approach too old-fashioned? Well, yes and no. I mean, the large historicism, like the way people used to say the Victorian age, right? Or the Arab mind, where they could make these large claims and then decide how literature was produced in that. That pretty much is dead. Only people who refuse to read Greenblatt and Foucault will do that. Now, The question of history, how Foucault and others have complicated is that history offering itself as natural. So, what has been put under erasure or under threat after Foucault and Derrida is this whole idea of someone believing that there is a pure history living somewhere out there. What now pretty much everyone believes is that history is textual, right? And since it is textual, our access to it is through language, right? Or through an act of interpretation. And that within that, there is no large history, as Foucault would teach us. There are silenced histories. So the project of history in New Historicism is to go and retrieve those silenced histories. Who was writing what when Shakespeare was writing? How was it circulated? So that's the historical project now. Uh, but yes, this large idea of history of Western civilization or American history by itself, that larger construct has been challenged by histories that were traditionally silenced. So yeah, I think anyone who makes these large mythological historical claims now is doing that because they are either intentionally they have not bought into the idea that the problematics of history, or they are not aware of it. In either case, you want to avoid them. Okay. uh, okay, Jami, I am very new to studying theories in literature. Would you mind listing the most salient theories in history of literature chronologically? um, as I said, you can just do a search on literary theories and they will say new criticism, new historicism, feminism, Marxism, formalism, structuralism, post structuralism. These are all major schools of literary theory, right? They are not necessarily chronological, and then there are permeations between the fields, right? But also one other thing, um, to train you is not think in these teleological times or history as a progress. Things don't happen in a neat fashion, like one thing happens and the other thing happens. No, sometimes things are happening simultaneously, and history is not a progressive narrative, because we always sometimes we achieve a thing and then we go back and become something else. These are some of the major theories. But as I said previously, if you just do a simple search on the web, literary theory, I will post a link to it in the recorded version of this as well, so that you can just click it and find out there are different wonderful websites that list each theory and give you what are its main characteristics, main challenges, and that can give you an introduction about it. But here is a cautionary note, and this is from the colonial educational system. If you're from India, Pakistan, anywhere else, if you still are in that colonial system, what we teach is the mechanics, right? And what is it? The questions aren't, here is a paragraph, read it as a new critic. The questions in your exams are, what are the 6 major attributes of new criticism, which you either have memorized or you need to know. So what we are then teaching is the characteristics of new criticism, or what is deconstruction. Here is a deconstruction, right? What we are not teaching them is, here, read your Derrida. Here is an essay explaining deconstruction, so that you understand it, consume it, and then practice it. So remind yourself that maybe for your classes you have to reproduce the 10 major aspects of new criticism or structuralism. But does that help you understand texts better? Are you learning theory in the process? If you are not, if you're only learning what a theory is, right? Anyone can do that these days. You just download it on your phone and read it. So that would be my suggestion for that. All right, Rahul, sir, आप कहाँ से हैं? I'm originally from Pakistan, from Rawalpindi, and now live in Texas. All right, good question. Okay, so I am looking at, Owas, I answered your question. So, okay, so here is another good question. Is equality possible as propagated by Marxists? If there is economic, why would people work? Good question. Why do we need to work? I mean, this whole idea which is being sold to us. Look, Marx literally believed that we are homo faber. Marx is not opposed to working, okay? And we disagree. We autonomous Marxists disagree with it. So the basic concept of the human, which is the humanistic core of early Marxist thought, was that he believed that deep down as human beings, we like to work. We like to produce, right? The question was that in capitalism, the worker works whatever job comes their way, right? They have to produce this thing and for the whosoever has hired them. So they are reduced to doing things, the labor or the work that they don't feel any affinity with, which is not part of their natural inclination. That is the concept of alienated labor. Labor performing repetitive work, producing commodities to sustain their life. So the purpose of the revolution to disalienate labor was not that they should sit down and stop working. The purpose was that labor should be reconciled with what they want to do, what is their natural inclination. That is the humanism in Marxist thought. That was the purpose of the revolution, not that people should stop working, but that workers should be disalienated and reconciled with what they love to do. Now, you, me, and everyone else, we all do that without being Marxists. Okay. If you are trapped in a job which you are only doing because you need to pay your bills, and if someone tells you you should be happy, you're like, no, I hate this job. But I have to do it because I need to, feed my family. But if you're doing something that you love, right, then going to work becomes a thing of pleasure. And that is because you are reconciled with what you think you love. Why do we keep looking for jobs that we like? Because we want to do something that we love and are. So is equality possible? Absolutely. What kind of equality? I mean, the basic principle, even non-Marxist, is that all human beings, regardless of their gender, regardless of their politics, sexuality, religion, are essentially equal. That's the basic principle of any decent thought, right? Ideologically speaking, there should be no gradation of this is more human and this is less based on race, sexuality, gender, all. That's the basic assumption. Can the world work with it? Absolutely. Why not? If we all have equal rights and we are protected, we can still have different stations in life where I go to a work factory and do my job, but at the end of the day, I tell the person, fine, I'm done, right? But if you have the word of the proletariat, then so much of what you need in life will be provided for because we are sharing the resources. No one owns capital, no one owns a factory, we own it, right? Is it possible? I don't know. The Marxist utopia pretty much has died, but is it something worthy to imagine? Absolutely. And this whole idea, I mean, what cuts across all these things? Religion cuts across all these things. Social controls cut across all these things, right? So, we tell people, no, my God says women and men are not equal, fine. But at the end of the day, I mean, an equal world would be a world in which you, me, and those around me have equal say, have equal value, equal respect as human beings, and no one gets to tell us that we are less than them in one way or the other. I don't think so. That's a Marxist ideal. It's a human ideal. And if we achieve it through Marxism, fine. If we don't, we can use another way of doing it. Okay, here, good. Modern academia heavily emphasizes specialization. Theory is an inherently multidisciplinary field. Do these things clash? Can a theorist who has trained in English departments truly matter or master? Okay. Well, yes, the specialization is, of course, necessary for pragmatic reasons as well. We cannot cover everything as scholars. So we specialize in a certain subject if you're getting a doctoral degree. That's all good. Yeah. I am a post-colonialist. Within that, I'm a post-colonialist who does South Asia. Within that, like Urdu and Hindi texts, right? And then I'm a Marxist. I'm this. But the reason we choose specialization is because we want to achieve expertise in a certain specific research area. That's the scholastic reason for it, right? The pragmatic reason for it is that if you look at the job list that comes out every year on the Modern Language Association website, the English jobs, English department jobs are already, they have their specific subfields. If you're a British lit scholar, there'll be romantics, job ads for Victorianists, job ads for British modernists, Shakespeare, Chaucer. These are some of the fields. If you are an Americanist, the field is more conceptual, but still period based. Early American, 18th century, 19th century, American realism, African American, American ethnic literature. So the pragmatic reason for specializing is to fit into one of those slots, because otherwise, what will you be applying for? And so the other reason for specialization also is to control the amount of knowledge that we study, right? Because we can't learn everything. Now, within that, you can be eclectic. There are scholars who just take it upon themselves to be Marxist, scholars who take it upon themselves to be feminist. So then they have a further defined expertise because they go and read all those works in that field. I have intentionally not done that. I dabble in everything, but I can't claim that I know this theory down to the dot. No. It has worked for me. It may not work for you depending on what area you want to specialize in. Now, there are options to be generalists, right? But the problem with the US job market is that if you are a generalist, then the only jobs that you can get will be the low paying jobs, the jobs that don't give you the kind of security you need. So, kind of the way the discipline is set, at least in English studies, is that it asks for that kind of specialization. Uh, Personally, what I've felt is that even if you specialize in a certain specific area, you always branch out. Like my next book has got nothing to do with literature, right now I'm reading, if you see those blue volumes in the back, reading 12 of them just to find out certain specific things about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, so that I can write a book about it. Now my conservative friends and colleagues would tell me that's not a book that belongs in the literature department. So I am at that stage in my career where I say I don't really care, right? But had I been an early career scholar, maybe I would be writing a different book. So all of these questions of specialization and broadening it depend on where you are in your career as a scholar and then where you want to go. Okay, Anum, I've been watching some videos and it appears that socialist thought in the US is becoming stronger and the current generation is becoming more Marxist. Do you think that change can happen? I'm not sure. Uh, I think that the activists are increasingly becoming more socialistic. And the credit goes to Bernie Sanders and all the others for making socialism not just a palatable concept, but also a concept that can be mobilized for social change. Um, so, youth and activists, yes, they always have had a socialistic agenda. And now increasingly, the interests are also coming together. Now the feminists are not there in their little silo, and the trans people are not in, they are collaborating and building solidarities for social change. How do I see its future in United States? I don't know. The reactionary forces in America are pretty strong. The problem with America is that it is a place of the most promise, but it is also good at squandering that promise. And the divide right now in American public sphere is people who belong to the future, the diverse group of young people, middle-aged people, to whom the future belongs, and a reactionary group who has a certain specific idea of race and who are terrified of this change. The only way they can control the situation is through coercive means, through ideological means, through religion. But anywhere in history, when thought, the current political and contemporary thought on a popular level, has crossed what was traditionally a line on the ground, nothing can reverse it. So these are all reactionary responses, and the only way they can keep it in place is dumb down the education, right? Play different racial hatred cards in politics, and constantly try to produce an uncritical public. And if they can do that, which still is trying to stem the tide of history, right? They might succeed, but I don't think so. So yes, I am on the side of the angels here. And I think socialistic in a sense that people want social justice, people want a more just distribution of resources and access to the national wealth. That has become a huge issue. And part of it is simply the wealth disparity is huge. You can't have an economy in which there is Jeff Bezos, and then there are 35 million people who reported last week to the Census Bureau that they don't have enough food to give their children. You cannot have this system and sustain it unless you divide the people on race and gender, so that I can be equally as poor, but as long as I'm white, I feel okay. As long as you don't cut across those solidarities through race and these fears and hatred of others, by and large, eventually, people will find a way to challenge this unjust system as it exists. All right. Let's see. Are there any other questions? I wasn't expecting a lot of you today, especially since in Pakistan and India and elsewhere it is Eid. So I'm really grateful that you all joined me today. As always, also, please feel free to suggest a topic. I am hoping to do one conversation on diaspora because someone had requested it. I still have to read up on it. And our semester is also starting soon, but I will continue doing these Saturday conversations. Not for you. I mean, these are good for me as well. I learn a lot, and it's kind of, meeting my friends every week. So, any other questions before I sign off? Now, just on a side note, I do have a new channel now. Okay, it's called Raja Against the Machine. Okay, don't laugh at it. We brainstormed the name on Facebook, and quite a few of my friends suggested that play on the words with Rage Against the Machine. So I didn't go with it unless Jenny, my wife, approved it. So Raja Against the Machine is online now on YouTube, and it is a more of a political channel. So I give my political opinions and my thoughts on politics in the US as well as in Pakistan. And the reason I wanted to have a separate channel was because, post-colonial space is basically an academic channel. And sometimes I felt hampered because, I needed to say something about contemporary politics, but I couldn't bring myself to say it on an educational channel. So please do check it out. Okay, there are some new questions. Oh, cool. So thank you, Jamie. You're from Morocco, one of my favorite countries. Uh, do you know Morocco was the first non-Western country to recognize United States as an independent nation? Uh, that, I mean, not that that should matter to you, but I always find it fascinating, and love the culture and history. I wish I could visit someday. Uh, okay. How can literary theory make the world a better place? How can anything make the world a better place? That's a really good question. But how can it? I mean, what do we do as literary scholars? Depending on if you use feminist literary theory, at least you're producing knowledge that challenges the patriarchal hierarchies. If you are a Marxist, you are challenging the way the world works and you disagree with it. At the end of the day, word doesn't change simply by the written word or the spoken word. You need a praxis for it. So what means you need a reflection and actual action. But if we who have the knowledge and understanding of culture, if we still do not try to produce works that at least try to point to certain injustices in the world or try to offer some solutions, who is going to do that? In the end, theory is not going to change the world, but theory gives us the tool to do the kind of work that might matter in the world, right? That might change the way people think. I mean, where do the Marxist political parties come from? You know, because there was a guy named Karl Marx who wrote a few books with empirical evidence, but mostly on economic theory, right? And who basically tried to tell us, let me tell you how capital works. How does it emerge, right? About, I think, 50, 70, 80, or 100 years later, we have a system of thought called Marxism. We have political parties called Marxist political parties. They actually win elections and try to run countries according to their understanding of capital. So, theory, how does it change the world? It changes the world by creating new thoughts, but also by creating new praxis. And we, as scholars, deciding that the work that we do isn't just going to be, writing essays that three people can read and understand, or essays that work only with the interiority of the text, but that work with the what Said would call exteriority of the text, the world in which the texts are produced and consumed. So maybe, someday things will change. Uh, okay. Okay, here, fields which lie outside of their, in other words, do historians consider the work of historicists to be up to snuff, or political theorists with Marxist theories? That's really a hard question for me to answer. But if you look at historiography already in history departments, they are already doing neo-historicism. And how? Increasingly, as the minorities enter the academy, instead of giving Texas history, there are people writing the history of the Mexican immigration to Texas. There are people writing history of homestead holders and women. So already that is new historicism, because they are relying on, they are telling the stories of what was otherwise not considered in a larger history. Um, Outside the department, I would say that most social scientists, anthropology has already changed. Okay, it has changed because of the works of structuralist and post-structuralist anthropologists, Said and others. So if we consider structuralism as a linguistic theory and literary theory, for anthropology, structuralism was something that liberated them from reading other cultures, and hence Levi Strauss and others developed what is now called the structuralist anthropology. There are Marxist ways of writing about history, where you write about the labor movements, where you write about how did people cope with, you know, the rise of capital, what were the post-Fordist labor movements. So obviously Marxism has an impact on that. So in my opinion, right now, when people are being purists that this is what we do, we are philosophy, we are not history, that's, to me, it comes across as reactionary. But since I have not been in a history department, I can't speak to it in a departmental manner. Okay, we went through that. Okay, Anum, thank you for that. Yeah, yeah, I'll keep producing more videos on the channel. Okay, what books would you suggest that would make the difference between communism and socialism clear, because Marx and so use it kind of interchangeably? Okay, so uh, there is a book by uh, Eagleton on ideology. That should make the difference clear. But I will find another more focused book. And I have a book back here. I think it's by Bloomsbury Press, and it's called Contemporary Marxism. So there are essays in it that would help with that. So, but I will come up with a better list and post it probably in the description to the recorded version of this conversation. Okay, Tom, I don't think so. All historians are purists. It depends on their politics. But I mean, if you look at um, there are feminist historians, there are Native American historians, there are Hispanic historians in United States. And so depending on where they are coming from, I would say that history departments constantly now, unless they live in a vacuum, have moved on to where they at least have someone doing more than just traditional history. Uh, how much of it is there will depend on the department and the region. But I think post 1980s historiography, with the challenges that came to it, uh, has moved into a more diverse way of doing history. There is a beautiful book by, okay, I'll forget the name of the author, but it's called, um, I'm forgetting the name, but it comes from India, about what is it called? Provincializing Europe by Deepesh Chakrabarti. I highly recommend it because it is about historiography, the field of historiography, and how to change it. And it's called Provincializing Europe. So, in my opinion, right now, any purist stances, at least in the institutional settings, are based in a total denial of the different opinions and theories that have already emerged. So most people who tend to be literary theorists or literary purists or historical purists, their response is not based in this idea that there is no other knowledge that exists. It's a complete denial or recognition of the knowledge that already exists. And that's how people do it. So why don't you crack a new theory? Well, I mean, I don't think so. I have the philosophical training to be the theorist at that scale. That's simply the point. I am someone who can read other people's work, consume it, understand it, and produce good work. But I wouldn't consider myself philosophically equipped enough to come up with something new. Now, having said that, my forthcoming book, right, Democratic Criticism, Poetics of Incitement, and the Muslim Sacred, is already, if not doing something new, it is challenging the European and American academy and the Muslim readers to think differently and respond to texts differently. So maybe that will be my contribution. So Okay, so trauma theory itself, I couldn't name you any theorists right now off the cuff. But anytime you are tracing the impact, first of all, of historical trauma, traumatic events, that will fall into trauma theory, right? So let's say if you are from India and Pakistan, the trauma of partition would be a part of it. The trauma of class, gender, caste would be a part of it. And what are you tracing in that is what are the social implications of trauma? What happens to individuals and their psyches? And what happens to collectives? What happens to groups and different classes? That's roughly what trauma theory does. And then what are the coping strategies and what are the challenges to the dominant discourses that cause trauma? But to be very honest, at this point, I couldn't name you a particular text that defines it as trauma theory. Jamie, I aspire to, you should be better than me. You know, I'm a has been. I want all of you as scholars and human beings to better than me 1,000 times because we need that in the world. But I mean, to be honest, you know, what should we do with what we have as scholars, right? Is be generous, right? Be kind. That's the least we can do for the world and for each other, right? So if you are in a position where if someone sends you a query or a question and you have the time and the knowledge to answer it, answer that, right? I mean, someone just asked how theory can change the world, but the question should be how we can change the world. So we change the world collectively through solidarities, right? And make it a better place. But individually, we change it by being generous, right? By being kind to others. And by, I don't know, having a certain degree of humility, but most importantly, by being open and generous to others. And that I think has worked for me throughout my life and will work for you too. Okay, Chandra. Sir, can you suggest some resources to learn how to deconstruct text? Not really the theory, but practically how to do it. So, if you can look up on Amazon or elsewhere, there are these brief sort of comic book books, okay, and they allow you to really learn the technique and just look up for comic book deconstruction and it should show up. But how to do deconstruction, I don't know if it can be really taught, but Derrida's essay, Plato's Pharmacy, and I have a lecture on it, you should look up on the channel. I use it as an example of how to learn to deconstruct a text, right? Because what Derrida is doing in that text is a truly great demonstration of deconstruction itself. As far as like, I don't know, I've never really read a reader that says how to do deconstruction. There are a few books on it, which I have one over there. I can't see it right now. But those are also just books that explain deconstruction as a theory itself. Now, that gives me an idea that maybe I should prepare some notes, an example of an essay, and then maybe record a video which says, this is how to do deconstruction, which would be a bit silly because one thing you can't do with deconstruction is give it a shape and form, right? You can't say these are the steps you're going to take. But I'll see if I have time. Maybe I'll use a brief poem or an essay and using whatever little I know about Derrida's technique, record a video that does that, how to do deconstruction. Or maybe if I find a resource, I will put it in the description of the recorded version. But good question, though. So it looks like we have already spent more than an hour. So thank you so much for joining me on this day, which is Eid for us, those of us who are from Muslim cultures, and for asking such wonderful questions. Now, as always, you can always send your questions to me through my website, postcolonial.net, or through the channel, and uh, and your suggestions for such weekly conversations. And then also, if I can be of any help, in your questions about theory or questions about learning, feel free to send them my way. Other than that, let me see, there is a last comment coming in. Okay, so good, Anam, thank you. So I think I'm going to conclude our today's conversation. But as always, thank you so much for joining me. And if all goes well, I will see you next week, Saturday, the same time. I will choose a topic from now until then. But if you have any suggestions about a topic, send them my way. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz. Dhanyavad. Bye. And in Morocco, Mas Salam, I think. So see you next week. Until then, stay safe and peace and love.